here I've got my next labor of love project here. This is DC to DC USB adapters. It's something that I've been fascinated in, DC to DC conversions in general. And over the last couple of years, I've bought a bunch of cheap ones and then finally started to realize there's a lot of differences in capabilities. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit because it's honestly pretty complex. So first thing you can see here is I've got buck only on these three, buck and boost on these two. That's something that you'll notice in terms of price. This is $8, that's $6, this is like $12, and this one's like 15 and that one's like 18. So that gives you some idea that the more expensive ones have the ability to buck and boost, but also in this case, they have the ability to do PD 100, which means that they can convert, say like a 13 volt input, which in this case dropped down 11, I'll explain that later, to a 20 volt output at 100 watts and to do it efficiently, reasonably efficient. So you're going to get a little extra out of that if you pay more for the PD 100 option. Whereas these cheaper ones, 35 and 45, that's still pretty good because if you go below PD 35, a lot of times they won't even ever have the ability to even buck down to get a 20 volt output. Like all these can take up to 30 volt input. But if you give a 26 volt output to input to a cheap one, you can't get a 20 volt output. You'll get maybe 12 or 9. So if you need a 20 volt output, in which case, say for example, to charge a battery like this, which is a 24 volt battery, it's got 6 cells in the series. So if you send over a 12 volt input to this PD port here, it'll take it. But then it has to boost that 12 volts up to 26 volts or maybe 24 volts to charge it roughly. As opposed to if you send a 20 volt, it's easier for it to just, it's going to be more efficient for it just to boost that up to, from 20 volts to 26 volts as needed. So it's always something where you want to manage your DC to DC conversions as intelligently as you can, because there's a little bit of efficiency to be gained by focusing on things like simply just having a better quality cable can make a difference in your voltage drop on that cable and stuff like that. So some tricks that you want to learn if you're doing a lot of DC to DC conversions, like if you have a home battery and a solar system, this is like a 13.3 volt to 13 volt battery for a lithium iron phosphate 4 in series, or if you have 8 in series, 26.6 volts, and if you have 16 in series, a lot of people do have 48 volts. Now these can all go directly, because they take up the 30 volt input, they can all go directly on a lithium iron phosphate home system. So that's pretty handy. And you might have a variety of reasons why you would want a PD 100 output, and you want that, spend the extra money on these. And also, I've taken this one apart. I have a couple of these. I took it apart and soldered some power wires directly to the board to get past this kind of cheesy cigarette plug adapter, which that's why I have the tape on here, because these things can be kind of loose in some of the cigarette connections. This way you actually can put it in and keep a nice pressure on this pin and have a nice solid connection, and this thing doesn't jiggle around. That's what I use the tape for when it's necessary. And of course you can see this one has just slide adapter instead of cigarette adapter, and that gives you a little bit of a better connection, but honestly I still wouldn't go above 10 amps on this thing, and the same goes for these. If you even at 10 amps it's going to be pretty hot. So in this case, where I went from a 13 volt battery and I boosted it to a 20 volt with 100 watts, that's something like 10 amps on the input side and maybe 5 amps on this output side. So that input side has a chance of getting hot, especially if you have a constant 100 watt load. That's probably something you generally would want to avoid. Now I have this written down as 11 volts because when I did the testing, I was actually running this through an ammeter on the input side, and the ammeter wiring was thin. So I made sure to test it after all those voltage drops. That way I got a nice accurate number here for my percentage of efficiency. Under normal conditions, you wouldn't be running that 10 amps through an ammeter through a bunch of test leads, so you wouldn't see that kind of voltage drop at all, although you might see some voltage drop. And on this one, I had exactly the same thing. It was more like 11.5 volts, and that's been taken into account in those calculations. So anyways, one of the first tests I did of interest here is charge a cell phone. It's a regular cell phone, but it takes 9 volts. That's considered like a semi-fast charge. And it's a common thing that the cell phone USB-C port will call for 9 volts. So I thought, all right, let's try it on 13 volts to 9 volts, and then we'll all do the same exact thing with 26 volts, check the percentages. And on these smaller units, the 35s and 45s and 55s, I got numbers like 95%, 93, 94. And even on these PD 100 ports, 93%, 93%, that was pretty good. When I went up to 24 volts, you can see I'm not getting as good of numbers because the voltage difference is so great. 90%, 90%, 90, and 85, 87 point something percent on these bigger guys. That could be an issue of kind of like load matching, like because if you look, this one has a PD 30 port on it, and it did a much better job, 92%. So that gives you some idea that if you're charging a cell phone on 26 volt input, and you're trying to get it down to 9 volts, you're better off to use the smaller. This is the PD 30 here versus the PD 100. That's a little weird piece of information I wasn't aware of. But anyways, 94, 95% is pretty darn good. And that's the kind of number that you want to see when you're doing a DC to DC conversion. And some of the highest numbers you'll see here are 96.4, for example. I don't have anything better than that. The next test of interest is getting a 100 watt output on the boost. Because again, these things don't have PD 100s and they cannot boost. But they can do 20 volts. If you give them 26 volt input, they can buck it down to 20 volts. So that's great. Same thing with this one. This little PD 30 port can do that. So my next test was, can I boost to get a PD 100 output? What kind of drop am I looking at? And as you can see here, this one did it 92.6. This one did 93.3. That's pretty darn good. I was happy with that. And when I put a 26 volt input, I get a much better figure. I get 96% and 95.8%. Now, I also did the test with a 60 watt cable instead of a 100 watt cable to force it to only get 60 watts so I could test that. And I see 96.4 or 96.2. So the efficiency was up a little bit because I had less load on the same exact system. And that gives you some idea, you know, there's not a huge difference in efficiency from a 60 watt load to a 100 watt load. So that's good to know. And that pretty much sums up the most interesting test data. So one thing I would like to point out is that each one of these has a weird little quirk. Like this guy, this $8 unit, it's got a pair of 35s on it. It can buck down to 20 volts if 20 volts are called for. So that's pretty handy. When I'm trying to charge like my drone batteries, for example, I use this guy because it can take a 26 volt and bring it down to 20 very efficiently, and only at 35 watts. Because I don't want to charge my drone batteries at a high rate of speed unless I'm in a hurry for some reason. But if you have a lot of batteries, you're never really in a hurry, so there's no reason to blast them. So 35 is kind of perfect, because if you go down lower than that to like say the 20s and 25s, they can't buck above 12 volts. Even if you give them a 26 volt input, they'll still just give you a 12 volt output. And then the drone battery cradle has to boost that 12 volts up to whatever voltage that the drone batteries need. I'd rather have it just buck down a little bit. So this is really good for that. When I first got it though, I noticed that when I left it plugged into my 26 volt outlet, after a while it was kind of warm to the touch. So I measured the standby power and it was like 55 milliamps, which is ridiculous. Usually it would be something like 6 milliamps, you know? And so I took it apart and I noticed there was 6 LEDs arranged around here, and I scraped them off one by one, and I saw the voltage, the standby power drop. Once I scraped the very last one off, the standby power dropped down to right where it should be, like 6 milliamps. And you can see I've got that on here somewhere, right there, 6 milliamps. That's on 24 volts. So that's a major quirk. And if you leave this thing plugged into 24 volts and you feel warmth, then that gives you some idea that, and I mean it was pretty warm to the touch. That gives you an idea you're burning off like a watt all the time, and that's 24 watt hours per day of just wasted electricity. So that's a quirk that was fixable in this case. Now this one has a quirk that's kind of not fixable. When I run the PD 30 port, I have a normal standby power of like 5 milliamps, regardless of if I'm on 12 or 24 volts. But when I run the PD 100 port, it all of a sudden jumps up. On the 12 volt system, it jumps up to like 25 milliamps. And on a 24 volt system, it jumps up to like 33 milliamps, which is almost a watt. And again, if I leave it in the cradle, I'll feel the warmth build up in this thing. Even if you disconnect the load, the standby power never goes back down to 5. So you have to unplug this from the socket and plug it back in, it'll drop down to 5. So that's kind of a not cool quirk that this particular one has. Here's another example of a weird quirk. This one is buck only, but if you give it a 13 volt input, it doesn't give you a 12 volt output, it gives you 9. If you give it a 26 volt input, it can do 20 volts, or it can do 12 volts if that's what's called for. But normally if you would get 12. Normally you'd buck down from 13 to 12, but this one just doesn't do that. And instead of a 55 watt output, you only get 25. So that's really that's kind of a strange behavior for this unit. That's one of those weird little quirks. Other than that, I think this one is great. It's got a little voltmeter on it, and the voltmeter in this case is actually accurate. Usually I don't get ones that have voltmeters on them, because if they're inaccurate, that can really give you some bad information. If it's 0.4 volts or 0.3 volts off, that's like that can really be majorly confusing trying to understand what's going on with your batteries. So I usually don't want these. And also, if you do have it and it's in blue, I think you'll notice that it's kind of blinding at night in dim conditions. In a camper or a tent or a dim living room or whatever, that blue light is kind of just blinding. If you get it in red, that's a lot better on the eyes. And for this guy, his little quirk is on a 12 volt, it can only do PD35. You have to go to a 24 volt to get that PD45 out of it. So that's kind of a strange little unexpected thing. Not a big deal, but worth mentioning. But for $6, not bad. Here's a tester that I used to calculate these on the output side. So you hook this up on the USB-C and hook up your cable, and you can actually get an instantaneous reading of volts, amps, and watts. And this particular unit has been very accurate. It's like plus or minus 0.1 watts generally. So that's pretty darn good. And it has the ability to do USB and USB-C. So it'll let you know, like, am I getting that 12 volts or 9 volts that I'm looking for, depending on the cable, depending on the adapter. There's all kinds of variables, and this gives you so much information. You can get these on Amazon. I got this on Temu. I'll put a link to it on the Amazon. Temu links are kind of sketchy because it makes you try to install apps and all kinds of stuff, and tries to get you to play games instead of letting you just look at the items. So anytime I share links, I'll put them on Amazon, not Temu, if I can. But this thing really takes a lot of the guessing out of understanding what's going on with your DC to DC conversions. And it works because it gives you the volts and the amps and the watts all in one display. That's kind of nice. Another thing I'll talk about quickly is the cables. This cable is labeled as a 240, which means that in theory it can handle 48 volts. But I don't have anything that even uses 48 volts. But what I have noticed is that if a cable says 240, it almost certainly can handle a 100. And in this case, it would be 20 volts times 5 amps. It means it can handle 5 amps without too much voltage drop. And you can check the voltage drop by using those USB power reading adapters, that power meter that I just showed. And I often see something like maybe 1% when it's under a heavy load with a cable like this. Now, when I wanted to do my test at 60 watts instead of 100, I used this thinner cable. And basically what that means is that this cable is only good for 3 amps. So it doesn't have a special microchip in it that says it'll take that 5 amps, whereas this one does. So these are both do 20 volts, but this one will limit it to 3 amps and this one will limit it to 5 amps. And here's an example of a brand that I found to be one of the best, actually. You can find these on Temu. This one is a USB-A to USB-C, but they also have USB-C to C and 10-foot, 6-foot lengths, and 3-foot lengths. So I love these cables. I love this brand. And I don't know if it's available anywhere but Temu, but I would search for that and highly recommend these. This is one of the most quirk-free ones, the one that's here on the right, the brand TOOCKI. I do believe you can find these on Amazon. At least they have some of their stuff. They have cables and power meters and all kinds of stuff. So this one is the same brand, and this is the same thing here. I've actually got a bunch of these, and it actually can do 95 watts of output, 2 at a time, if you give it that 26 or 24 volt input. I've done that test. So it does do what it says. It delivers what it says it can. Although you're not going to be able to do that on a 13 volt input because that would literally be like 20 amps on this side. That's not going to work. So you can do it with 24 because you're limited probably more like 8-9 amps if you do that. And while it does say that it's 100, it's actually more like 95. And while it does say it's 20, it's actually more like 19.5. That's maybe the only quirk with this unit. And these things are $18 on Temu roughly. Sometimes you can find deals and different ways of doing things with Temu to get these a lot cheaper though. And like I said, I don't know if I mentioned that I took this one apart and soldered directly to the board so that I would have a 13 volt to 20 volt adapter that I use to power my laptop. And that allows it to get a lot more cooling. I just took it right out of the housing and just soldered it directly and wrapped a little bit of tape around it. And I used a really nice, heavy, beefy wire. And then I made sure that this C-to-C connection was going to be a lot shorter, like a 3-foot. And then I used an adapter like this. So basically this has a USB-C input and it calls for 20 volts. So if you have one that the DC barrel matches your laptop, now you've got a 20 volt laptop adapter that can come from a 12 volt power source. Well, that about wraps it up for this video. I just wanted to run these DC conversion numbers across so you guys have a general idea what kind of range we're talking about. And I'm very happy with these numbers. Almost every test has been really impressive in the 90s, so that's much better than I thought. And you have other conversion losses before and after, so it's really important to minimize these conversion losses as much as possible to understand how you can choose your voltages that makes the most sense. There's so many different DC devices coming out now, whether it be like these tool batteries and vacuum cleaners and everything, power stations. If you have a power station that's kind of older and you stick one of these in your 12 volt outlet, now all of a sudden you've got PD 100 output that's reasonably efficient and stable. So there's a lot of advantages to being able to understand all these little different complexities of USB-C, and it's going to become more and more relevant as we go. So thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate it.